Hi, the music stopped. Welcome. I will introduce our guest in a minute. My name is Ole Reissmann. I'm working at Spiegel in Hamburg as a managing editor in editorial development. So after the print magazine, we look after apps and new platforms and really want to live in digital. That's very new for us and exciting. And when I look out of my window, I see the central station in Hamburg. And in the last, couple of months, from time to time, there is a green train approaching Hamburg Central Station. And that train is not really owned, but it's operated by FlixMobility. And today we have our guest here. It's Daniel from FlixMobility. He's one of the 3 founders of one of the big German success stories. When TechCrunch is reporting on FlixMobility, they call it Uber-like, because you really build a big platform, you cater to millions of users, and you disrupted a whole industry. Please, everyone, welcome Daniel from FlixMobility.
Thanks, Ole, for the warm words and the introduction. Happy to be here. Munich is always great to be because it's just a couple subway stations from the office.
So what we want to do now is I will ask some hopefully provocative questions to Daniel, and we'll ask him about the future of mobility and how exactly FlixMobility is doing. And if you, the audience, have any questions, please make yourself noticeable, and I will jump at you with a mic, and you can ask your burning questions to Daniel. This is your chance. Let's do this in an open, interactive way, and please help our discussion and ask everything you want to know about FlixMobility. Maybe this is the moment you all can start prepare some questions to make Daniel sweat. Okay, so first of all, my own publication, I mean not Spiegel, but Manager Magazine, gave FlixMobility an award. They called them Game Changer last year. But if you really look at FlixMobility, that's old buses driven by diesel engines. It's old retrofitted trains. So it's basically new paint for a very old model of mobility. What's the innovation?
So I think it was the year before last year when we earned that award. And well, when we started, people talked about us being a disruptor. And the fun fact is we've never been, because disrupting means destroying anything. And as you said, there's lots of old stuff we use and we didn't destroy anything. We rather innovated parts of the offline product. I mean, it has been celebrated quite a bit that we brought Wi-Fi or internet to the buses. I usually say Wi-Fi because I can guarantee that there is Wi-Fi. I not always can guarantee that there is internet. And that was, on the one hand, on the offline product, a game changer, because imagine prior to that, we had no chance, neither in airplanes nor in trains, to be connected entirely. We started that in 2013, and personally, I had my first internet connection, I don't know, 98 or so. It was
way early.
I mean, it still beeped when I connected, but it was about like late 90s, and that means it's 15 years from that point in time where people celebrated us with a game changer award because we brought internet to buses. But what we really did is we changed a little bit the way of mobility in several ways. So first of all, it's a process kind of innovation. It's not necessarily only a product innovation. So imagine before buses were allowed in Germany, you had barely any possibility to do something aside of your own car. And not only us, but also the public transportation or the Deutsche Bahn had a huge increase over the time because that policy has changed. So there is just an additional way being transported, apparently. And this is what we just took as a chance. And yes, we use software to make that piece of mobility a little better. So, for instance, when we started, some of you may remember, back then, Deutsche Bahn, which unfortunately didn't make it today, had 2 apps, one for looking and one for booking. Not quite obvious, but that was how it was back then, and usually people just had to go to the train station and really figure out what is the cheapest ticket. We just came up with a software platform which makes ticketing and these kind of experiences rather easy. And what is even more important is we put our network based on the demand out there. This is fairly new because in the past, many of the long transportation companies have been owned by the government, and the government just put supply out there, and they can do because they think they're here to provide certain stuff, as an example, mobility, and they wouldn't care whether we need it here or there, what regions are important, what times are important. And therefore, we see many, many buses and other vehicles running around empty in certain areas in Germany because it's not demand-driven. When we came up with the FlixBus model, we really looked like almost a year throughout the internet at timetables of Deutsche Bahn. We back then scraped carpooling in order to understand how traffic flows, and based on that, we built, at least in Europe, the first demand-driven mobility service.
But that's not the only thing you did, and that's not the only thing, or not the only way TechCrunch called you the Uber-like bus company. But you moved rather aggressively. You not only launched a product and an app which allows such things as surge pricing. If there's a higher demand, you as a customer got to pay more money. If the weather's rather good and people want to take the bus, it costs more, and so on and so forth. But what you did is you took on venture capital early on, and you decided to crush the competition. There were other companies trying the same as you, maybe most famously Postbus and MyFernbus, and you bought them. That's rather old school capitalism, isn't it?
Well, the magic of platform businesses is that they leverage economies of scale much more than others. And in order to provide an ongoing reliable service on a decent price, you have to have the power of, well, not only supply, what we created based on the general demand, but you have to create a certain demand, so many, many millions of customers. And these you can only attract to your platform if there is something for each and everybody. So imagine it's not only the price, as you mentioned, we do that similar to airlines, but it's about the inventory. One reason...
And who doesn't like the airline industry as a customer? I mean, come on.
Well, it depends a little bit on the service level. There are airlines I like. Yeah, of course. There are a couple more I don't. And it's not perfect, not even on our side. There are quite some areas to improve. But back to what I wanted to say is the inventory is the game changer. So the reason we go to Amazon, for instance, is not because it's the cheap place anymore to get things. Back then, in the early days of the internet, we compared almost everything on Google. And now we don't do that anymore. We just go to Amazon because of the service level, because we know we get everything we want over there. And we would take even a little higher price because it just works. And that's a reason why platforms work and why we, from day one on, didn't want to specialize in certain regions or in certain modes of transportation. We just said we want to build a Europe-wide alternative to the rather old state-owned railways, or as an alternative to individual traffic, or apparently also to the airline industry. And therefore, we had to grow fast. And yes, compared to others, we truly wanted to win that market from day one on. And that you could call a little bit aggressive.
Just a little bit. And the market, to be clear, that's not only Germany, or that's not even Europe. It's even one of the biggest consumer markets in the world right now, or one of the most profitable. It's even the US. Like, you ventured into the United States. You're going coast by coast.
Not yet.
Not yet.
So we started on the West Coast a year ago, and
then there's Bolt Bus on the.
Now we started on the East Coast as well, but we don't do coast by coast, and I don't think you'll see green buses doing coast by coast.
But my point is, your ambition is not only we have a market here in Germany or in Europe, but the market it's global.
And that's the point. Independent of whether you're a platform and you merge with other companies or you take over other companies, you must not forget about that what it is about, and that's a service to the customer. So the customer on a daily basis has to decide again for you as a service, for us now, either taking the bus or taking the train, but against an individual car, against Deutsche Bahn or against even an airline. And in the US, against Greyhound, Bolt Bus or a Megabus. And that is independent of, you know, your platform economic model. And yes, in the US, we started, and well, the truth is, in comparison to Germany, that was a new market. So even with PR, with you guys writing about how that new mode of transportation appeared, that was something where we had to train people to use buses again. In the US, it's a little different. This is just competition. We just have to provide a better service than Greyhound or Megabus and have to make people using our service. The good thing is, what is similar is we attract much more people who have never used a bus before. And that's the same in the US as it has been in Germany.
If you have any questions, please raise your hand. You have the one chance. Here's the one German startup that doesn't want to sell furniture on the website, or it goes into, I don't know, real estate. This is a real innovative company. Let's just circle back for a little bit to Uber and the Uber comparison. They are thinking of, I don't know, in 5 or 10 years, maybe we don't need drivers anymore. Maybe cars will drive themselves. So as a company, FlixMobility, you don't own buses right now. The buses are independently operated, which is very convenient for you as a company, I suppose. But if you look into the future, maybe 5 years from now, you started experimenting with electric vehicles. You bought, I don't know, maybe that was more of a PR stunt, 1 or 2 buses from China, from different companies to try out what's the range, how could this possibly work. But to come back to Uber, you worked with companies and you basically tell them, well, in 5 years, we are not quite sure, maybe we own our own fleet of electrical self-driving buses. How is that working out in a relationship to your bus drivers?
So there are a couple notes to that. First of all, it's not been proved yet that autonomous vehicles are cheaper to operate than it is with humans. So apparently it's just much more, you know, technology injected and therefore just more expensive currently. It's the same with electric vehicles, by the way, just because of the battery. So I'm not sure whether this will truly be the case as Uber is hoping for. On the one hand. On the other hand, well, they really have to bet on this kind of change in mobility because, I mean, Dara said when they ran IPO, I cannot promise whether we will ever be profitable. That's the difference and why we're proud of being a German startup. Well, it was always important for us to become profitable early, and which we are from 2017 on. So it's not the case that we totally have to disrupt ourselves. You have to adjust yourself always and make sure you stay ahead and you know, are part of shaping the future of mobility. But it's not like I have to rely on a technology which is not sure whether how cheap it is or when it will take place. That's the first thing. So the other thing is I don't believe that we are going to see fully autonomous vehicles in 5 years. That just takes longer. We recently saw a couple studies of some technology experts which now admitted that it might take longer. And this is also what I think. Given the matter of fact that buses are usually at the lower end of you know, the products OEMs take care of. So imagine buses even have steering columns attached to axles. There is no steer-by-wire as you'd see at the new S-Class or something, so there's quite a way to go. But it does not have to be fully autonomous yet. I mean, there are current technologies which you can leverage on the way there. Imagine you just take VR or AR technology and mix it up with the current level 3 autonomous systems, or you know, the more enhanced driving assistance systems, and then you could imagine that in rather free, not so humanly crowded areas like the Autobahn, buses can be run by itself. But on the other side, bus drivers can just sit at home and do have to work less shift and just, you know, pull up their VR goggles and take the bus from the depot to the station and then let it flow on the Autobahn where it flows automatically, and another bus driver may catch it or close to the exit. These scenarios we'll see earlier, something I can imagine in between 3 to 5 years, but then it certainly takes another, eventually even 5 years until we see fully autonomous vehicles. On the one hand. On the other hand, Still, it's about the service level. So I'm not afraid of artificial intelligence and that it will, really make us losing all of our jobs. I think the human interaction and that what makes you feel comfortable running whatever mode of transportation is a little bit of the human interaction. So what we cannot afford now is something like a service agent within the buses because, well, it's just, we couldn't afford basically. At the end, if buses may get cheaper because of autonomous vehicles, well, you could imagine we just increase the service level within the buses and therefore increase the quality of traveling. So it's not that we have a rather heavy debate about that with the bus drivers. And ultimately, well, bus drivers is a really rare good. This is quite a hard job, so kudos to all of our drivers. And it's not that we have too many of them, it's rather kind of a dying job profile.
So I suppose you could say there are maybe two challenges coming up right now. One challenge is maybe you were not aggressive enough. There are other companies that will put an app on my phone or on a skill on my Alexa device, and they will cater for all my mobility needs. So whether I need an electric scooter such as, I don't know, Circa or Tier in Germany, or I need a car, or I need a moving van to I don't know, carry some boxes, or whatever I need, there will be the one provider that caters for my needs. Why are you at the moment focused on buses and city-to-city transportation? Why is the FlixMobility app not helping me getting from point A to point B, but just from city to city, and the rest, well, it's up to you? So
you're right. I think what we have to see way earlier than totally autonomous electric-powered buses or trains is a door-to-door kind of travel compendium thingy, because this is super annoying and you have a bunch of apps. Still, you really have to rely on your strength. So wherever you started with, you have to be good at something, and then you can see how you grow and just add stuff. And adding stuff means you can either grow into a certain other market, and the inner city mobility market, domestic, is just a different market, or you can partner up. That is another possibility. When having discussed our business model and discussing it regularly again, where we would go into and how we would, change ourselves and adjust, and we really focused on long-distance ground mobility. So that's one of the reasons why never has seen us, joining the discussions about Air Berlin and stuff, because we don't currently believe the aviation market is interesting enough, and we also believe that there's currently too many players around serving the inner city mobility. Therefore, we just do not want to add us as another player into the competition. We'd rather partner up with, for instance, Uber recently in the US or here in Germany. And most importantly, I don't think adding a bunch of new black cars or a bunch of new colorful scooters will really help us. What helps us, particularly here in Europe, is a better public transportation. So what I would love to do is to connect the MVG or the HVV or whatever they're called in Germany or across Europe closer to us. And that's rather a policy challenge, because these companies are not close to be privately owned. So they have no incentive that they connect and help private companies like us, but also others, to create such an ecosystem I would love to see.
But sorry to interrupt you, but that's already happening, right? Because on my phone there's Google.
Well, Google
there's Uber, they pay for ads in Google. There is my regional transportation, there's buses, there's subways. Maybe at the end you're just a service provider and you got to pay Google to list your service on the Google Maps app.
So Google is always a competitor to almost every mode of business you can imagine. But they don't do that all the time. They could have done quite some competition towards Booking.com. They could have done quite some competition to whatever Kayak.com, because these services are available. And yes, of course, you can also look up our buses through Google Maps. But on the other hand, Google's money-making machine is advertising. And if you'd cut off us, Booking.com, Lufthansa, or whoever they are, even Uber, and do that kind of competition, well, they may dry out their, greatest revenue stream, which is us paying to be above Deutsche Bahn, to be above SNCF in our case. And therefore, Google is not yet a real competition, and they're very careful about where they push. And Google Maps is rather to inform yourself. The entire through booking experience is not what they're currently pushing. I mean, there are other services, you're right, like Movil, but we've been seeing Movil as a Daimler daughter trying that out forever. I know that because they apparently are an investor in ours, and it just doesn't pick up because they have, again, such a challenge to connect the public transportation, which is so important because way more than 50% of our people hitting any central bus station just go there by public transportation.
So let me try another challenge. You're a data-driven company. You learn from the data that your millions and millions of users give you. You can adapt to the needs of the people who want to take a bus ride. But lately, you mentioned SNCF, the French are coming. Blah, blah, blah. So just when we thought this is sorted out, it's over, there's one monopoly, they have 98% of market share in Germany already. There's new competition around the corner. Blah, blah, car, which is a ride-sharing community. It started out as a ride-sharing community. Some of you might remember Mitfahrgelegenheit, which was like when I was studying in university. It was a really fun community. There was a forum. We were posting, oh, I'm going from city to city. Who wants to join me? There were no cost involved whatsoever. Then BlaBlaCar came along, bought Mitfahrgelegenheit. Now it's service I got to pay for. They have data, huge amounts of data. They know where people want to travel, people who are looking for a price range that might be a bus ride, and they start bus. So did you overlook that there is a data treasure up for grabs and you didn't bought them, and now that's the new competition and they will...
So it is competition. It always has been on the one hand. On the other hand, the reason why we don't call ourselves a monopoly is because people can choose the mode of transportation on a daily basis.
That's why you have journalists. We will call you the monopoly.
Fair enough. So that means everybody could have chosen BlaBlaCar over a bus or over a car, a train, whatever, in the past already, or carpooling, which was the English term of Mitfahrgelegenheit. And therefore, we thought... ultimately, it's complementary, and you could even work together because there are certain routes where you cannot operate a bus or a train profitable because there is too less traffic. Well, now they have taken over Ouibus, which used to be our largest competitor in France, and with not only the data but also the knowledge of Ouibus, they now rebranded that into BlaBlaBus and are going to start competition here in Germany, but also other countries, and that's how we take it. It's competition, so it's now a little bit more focused and with a certain view on what they're doing and where they could be successful or no. But eventually, our business stays exactly the same, trying to convince the customer on a daily basis. And now you have to be a little bit more careful because they just have an additional choice. And we welcome that competition and will make sure that a customer will remain choosing green over... I'm not sure what their color, red, I think, green over red buses. And then we see.
What do you see?
We see whether
at one point they're like a bigger competitor, and you just buy them.
No, we see whether who of us is able to convince more customer to take each or the other brand for riding from A to B, and well. There are no thoughts yet to take them over. I mean, I don't think there is a reason because the data you've been mentioning is very similar. So it could be that we look into starting our own carpooling service because that could be also long distance ground transportation. As I said, this is the core of our business model, but currently there are no plans to take them over.
So. I gotta ask him about the trains and Flix trains. If you have any question, please, now is the moment. We're running out of time. If you don't raise your hand right now, there might be no chance to ask Daniel, and I will interactively...
If he says it like that, it seems that I'm not going to leave that
I will hold on the mic.
cube
really
ever
fast
again.
Don't worry. So, are there any plans on going into Asian markets? I mean, you expanded to Eastern Europe
Yes.
and everything, so next step.
Yes. So we're thinking of next steps. What we do is we have our corporate development team, which is continuously looking around the world. And what we do is we come up with some metrics, more or less, where we see how large are markets, how well is the structure there. So could we start in terms of quality, bus providers, reliability, and ultimately how close is the culture to us? So how difficult it is to understand the market in terms of the customer. And there drops usually whatever, 5 to 10 new markets out of these regular exercises, and then we just prioritize them and start one over another. We now had to focus to the US quite heavily and are going to start Russia, which is kind of Asia already this year. Next year there will be more Asian countries to come. I think it's been public already that we're currently starting to hire an Indian team.
So in the future, we are in your back now. In the future, I will take a Flix bus from Hamburg Central Station and go over to
Neu Delhi,
Moscow, and then through Russia, and I will end up in Neu Delhi. When I was growing up, I was always thinking, oh, well, there's a train, and that's the future of transportation, but that seems to be changing. We have another question from the audience.
Yeah, just a very quick one. Who's actually buying a bus to then have it operated and fully branded by FlixBus?
So that's kind of mid-sized bus companies. We have approximately 350 mobility operating partners. Most of them are bus partners, some of them are train partners meanwhile. And usually these are, as said, mid-size, KMU mid-size companies, like third generation bus operators, regionally settled. And what they do is they usually have their businesses in transporting, school kids or doing public transportation, where they get, their orders from the MVVs and these kind of companies. And the challenge they had is that they couldn't really grow, since that market had been settled forever. And we convinced them that it's not about setting up individual non-aligned brands, because then you have only a regional focus and cannot create as much traffic as you would need, so that combined inventory. So we, with Flix, kind of created the umbrella and therefore the brand, and convinced them to just take that opportunity to grow their business and have additional revenue stream aside of public transportation and eventually school transportation. And in order to do so, it's been recognized all over the place the same. We just asked them to brand their buses green, which is just foiled basically. And in exchange, they get a certain amount of the revenue. So there is some standard monthly pay they get in order to, make sure during winter times, certain days, or if they ramp up, they're kind of protected and will not run into heavy losses. And then if it runs, we just share revenues. And
about 25%, right?
Yeah, 75 to them, exactly. That's the way. And that's how we could have convinced them. Exactly, it's about optimizing the usage of the fleet, and it's about growing the business, having just additional options of making money.
And there's a way that worked beautifully with buses, and you conquered the market. But then there's trains, and I don't know, there's this cliche saying, space is hard. I don't know about trains. Are trains hard? I mean, why not? I mean, the model is basically the same. You do not own the trains.
Trains is harder.
You just supply the branding and the customers. They come through you, and independently the trains are operated and run on the tracks of Deutsche Bahn.
Exactly.
Why not get rid of it? From what we see,
rid of what?
Rid of the trains. From what we see from the outside, it's a mess. It's just not working. You gotta apply.
So rid of trains in general, or rid of our trains?
The Flix train business.
Okay.
Because like Deutsche Bahn is really giving you a hard time. There are lawsuits involved. It costs.
Not even showing up. This is giving me a hard time.
And it just doesn't seem to be an easy way to say, okay, well, there's demand. We could drive a bus from Hamburg to Hanover. I don't know. You can do that in at your company, at your scale, a couple of hours, and you have a new connection between Hamburg and Hanover. For trains, you got to get the rolling stock, you got to apply to use the tracks, you have to integrate into the Fahrplan in the schedule. It's a mess, and it takes ages, and it's hard, and the customer experience in these very old rundown trains isn't just not so good. Why bother at all?
So first of all, we don't call them old, we call them vintage, and that's an experience. And by the way, we are starting to refurbish our entire fleet and take quite some invest, so it will remain vintage, but with a way better...
I'm confused. You invest in the trains, but you don't own the trains. How is that working?
Well, we always invest into the customer experience, independent of whether we invest in our app or, in that case, eventually also in our offline product in the trains. And yes, we don't own them, as it is the same model with the buses. And we have seen private train companies around for, not forever, for a couple of years already in Germany. The challenge was that they, also with the buses, they only had a regional focus and therefore could not create enough traffic to fill up the trains. Trains are awesome because they are, on average, faster than buses, and they have a higher capacity. That means for certain relations, it just makes so much more sense to run a train over a bus. One of the best examples is Cologne, Berlin. And because of Deutsche Bahn, for instance, didn't do it well in our point of view, well, EasyJet and Ryanair particularly picked up quite a bit between Cologne and Berlin. This is not necessary. You can do that and serve that quite well with a train, but you can't by bus because it just takes too long. And therefore, this was one of our newest tracks, and it was super important for us to get. But yeah, it is hard. I'm not quite sure if it's as hard as space, but since it is a highly regulated market, and if people ask me what stops us from growing even faster, aside of making sure that our organization is being structured well and is able to grow, the only thing which prevents us from growing faster is policy and high regulation, and that's exactly the case in the train market. And it's not necessarily only about Deutsche Bahn, it's about our government and how that is being structured, and I think most importantly is how tracks are being set and sorted out, and how you get these concessions. And on the other side, it's totally about these wagons, because for a bus you can go just to Daimler and say, I'd like to have a bus. For trains, that takes. And there's also something where not only we suffer, but also Bahn, because they're waiting for ICEs almost since I can think of. And that's the same for us. But at the other hand, this is a superior product. And we think we need more trains, for instance, against domestic aviation. So there is almost no need in Germany to fly. You just would need a better high-speed train setup. And, well, I think some competition is good to also eventually push the Bahn to improve their service, and at the end come to a level where you see way more green trains, and here and there eventually better white trains as well.
How many years are we talking? Is it a long shot, or is that something you invest like money into it, do political lobbying in Berlin, spending money on campaigning? So for us, it's a long shot, because the company is about 6 years old. And if we talk about trains and being really relevant in Germany as a railway provider, we're talking about 3 years eventually. And so for us, it's a long shot. If you talk people around the train industry, they would say like, damn, this is fast. But we're pretty sure we can achieve that. And in order to do that properly, well, we of course talk to politicians and make clear that competition is good at the end, because you'll increase the service level to the customers. And I mean, there was a reason why we didn't start with Berlin, Munich, and I would have loved that track, because I personally live in Nuremberg and I'm every other week in Berlin and in Munich, so awesome. But our wagon material wasn't capable to run on the high-speed track. And yes, the officials could have reduced the ICE speed there on a couple kilometers an hour. Would not have affected the timetable of Deutsche Bahn too heavy, but they didn't. And we didn't like that, because then we had to admit we are not ready for this track yet. In order to make sure this doesn't happen again in the future,
we are in quite intense talks with policymakers all around Germany and also Europe.
If you have any last questions for Daniel, I have one, but if anyone wants to pick up.
Journalists always have questions down there. Isn't that your job to have questions?
That's my job.
Yeah, exactly
right.
How do you see the return on invest on sustainability? For example, you could invest more in that. On the other hand, you're not a non-profit. So where do you see the sweet spot?
So what we do, and we do that since almost the first day, is we offer to compensate your carbon footprint. And in comparison to aviation, we are rather good in how many people do that. But it's still a one-digit percentage, so not really good. What we do is we take that money and try to invest it exactly in those NGO-related, not necessarily only environment, ecological stuff, but also humanity. And we usually top that up with our own money to invest, on the one hand. On the other hand, we are doing these e-mobility tests because, well, yes, our fleet is entirely the newest, 98% of the newest diesel engines, which is okay. And since you share mobility, it's always better than individual mobility. But at the end, we would really love to see that elevating into e-mobility. Personally, it turns out...
I mean, you could do it. It's just like a bus costs double the price.
Exactly. So it turns out that battery-driven e-mobility is not what will sort it out. We did surveys. If people are willing to pay more to just be totally free carbon dioxide-wise, they're not. And therefore, we really have to think of more hybrid models or eventually fuel cell. And our challenge is that we have not the money in the bank account as Uber had, so we can't really build our own bus. It's not what we do. We keep on bugging the Daimlers, the MANs, and also the Chinese running around, but that will take, unfortunately, a little longer. Then, well, here and there, we just partner up with NGOs in order to support, certain initiatives, whether it's, again, society, humanity related or ecologically related. But we could do a little more, and we try to find out where the invest is best. And we ultimately think the highest lever is that we can convince more people to compensate their carbon dioxide. As said, we're better on average than the aviation industry, and as far as I know, also better as Deutsche Bahn. But I think even more people can just pay that couple cents what it is to really, make a change.
There was one more, or somebody raised a hand?
I think you raised the hand, right?
Okay, good.
All right.
Okay, perfect. Daniel, thanks so much. I have one last question. On this stage, later on today, we will talk about other modes of transportation and new forms of mobility. Someone who's involved with Elon Musk and Hyperloop is coming around. So 5 years from now, we're in Munich. You had to fly by plane, you're at the airport. Which is your preferred mode of transportation to go into the city? Is it the autonomous helicopter or is it the Hyperloop? And why?
Well, I do not want to disappoint people, but I take a bet on it will remain being the S-Bahn.
Daniel, thanks so much.
Thank you. Well, you're welcome.
Thanks.